Anyone with a fleeting knowledge of the board gaming hobby and the people behind the games we love so much has heard the name Martin Wallace. The mention of his name will likely conjure visions of railroads, networks, empire, civilization, war, and the great works of author Terry Pratchett. With over 25 years of game design experience and more than 70 published titles, Wallace is a household name in our hobby. He truly is a master of his art. Being known primarily by the tremendous depth of his previous work, how was it that he has come to design his newest published work, an arena combat miniatures game called Wildlands? Throughout his career, one principle is carried on throughout: the ideal of refinement. Though not as distinctly segmented as the master fine artist Pablo Picasso, looking through the body of work of Martin Wallace, there is a clear similarity that emerges. Periods of explorative progression of design in which he works to refine a specific set of game mechanisms and concepts. To quote Mr. Wallace himself, "One should always be striving to improve your art, mastering different techniques, attempting to come up with new mechanisms and concepts. I feel that I've learned my craft through constant practice." Focusing specifically on the Wallace Rail series, beginning with arguably his most famous work, Age of Steam, we see a natural and organic progression through his successive designs, including Steam, Railroad Tycoon, later that was rethemed to Railways of the World, and beyond. Each design shares a common theme, of course, but more acutely, a distillation of the core mechanisms. It's often debated which should be considered his finest work, and of course that comes down to the individual gamer's tastes. But one fact remains, that each successive design possesses a refinement on the network building mechanisms. Innovation and refinement on this specific set of mechanism even continues into numerous other designs from Martin Wallace, including the industry-building classics Brass and Age of Industry, and even beyond in his more recent installment, Via Nebula. Similar patterns grew from his desire to explore deck building as a mechanism, popularized by Donald X. Vaccarino with Dominion. In his deck-building series, being kicked off with A Few Acres of Snow and progressing through A Study of Emerald, Mythotopia, and finally with A Handful of Stars, each game built upon what was learned from the last design, while still providing a new and unique experience each time, but it still retained deck-building as its core mechanisms. In these games, each card possesses a series of icons that enable the player to fuel desired actions. Building a competent deck to focus on your strategy is key to your success in these games. Fast forwarding to the present, Wildlands is an arena combat miniatures game, which many would feel is uncharacteristic of Martin Wallace. Even I raised an eyebrow when I initially heard about it. But when you take a closer look at the mechanisms at play, we see more of this refinement pattern that we've seen in the past. In Wildlands, each player controls a team of adventurers, searching the land for magical crystal shards. To win the game, you must gain 5 points. Collecting one crystal shard will gain you 1 point. But eliminating an opponent's character will likewise gain you a point. In the base game box, there are 4 factions represented: the Guild, the Lawbringers, the Nomads, and the Pitfighters. And I'd like to take this quick opportunity to highlight the beautiful artwork by the sculptors Tim Prow and Bobby Jackson. The characters are brought to life with these beautiful sculpts. Both artists have been sculpting for over 25 years, creating miniatures for games, each continuing to refine their own craft with each subsequent project. The miniatures for Wildlands were sculpted based on the beautiful artwork provided by Alan Spiller and Jan Tisserand. To speak further on bringing these characters to life, each faction in Wildlands brings their own playstyle to the table with their own specific faction deck. Based on the theme of each warband, they could be defensive, mobile, ranged, or up close and personal with strong melee capabilities. You'll initially be dealt 10 map cards, which correspond to spaces on the board. You assign 5 of those cards to your own characters as their deployment locations. Then, the other 5 cards are handed to the player to your left. These 5 cards will be where that player needs to deploy their crystal shards on the board. As I mentioned earlier, there are 2 ways to score a point. You could either collect your own crystal shard from the board, or you could attempt to eliminate another player's character. Allowing each player to dictate where another player must deploy their crystals on the board gives them some knowledge of where that player will be headed to collect a point. And you have the opportunity to deploy your characters with intent of ambushing them when they go for their crystals. On your turn, you have a choice of actions, but those actions require that you play cards from your hand to take them. Within the scales on the left, each card has a series of icons that represent select characters. This denotes which characters can be activated by playing the card. You can always move or claim crystals by playing a card with a character's icon on it, but to the right, within the flag, a special icon is assigned to each character individually. These special actions are how you perform melee or heavy melee attacks, ranged or heavy ranged attacks, area attacks, and a host of defensive abilities. Many characters can rally other troops, and some can even fly. You have a limited number of cards available to you each turn, so managing that resource of cards is critical to optimal play. This concept is not entirely new to Martin Wallace and his catalog of games. In the 2-player variant for Moonga Invaders, Mad Scientist and Atomic Monsters Attack the Earth, Wallace first explored this concept of actions via hand management. And it wouldn't be a great leap to liken this concept to his deck-building series of using icons to fuel actions. And again, we see a trend of long-term refinement of game mechanisms. A key innovation upon the already existing hand management mechanism from Moonga Invaders, and another reason that managing your limited resource of cards is so critical, is the interrupt system. Players can take as many actions as they like on their turn as long as they have cards to do so, but you may want to keep some of those cards for use out of turn. While another player is taking their turn, if you possess a card that has an interrupt icon, you can play that card to halt the action and begin your own series of reactionary moves and attacks. This allows the players the opportunity to ambush the other players at a critical moment. Prior to being a game designer, Martin Wallace was a history teacher, and much of his thematic inspiration for his designs came from real-world history. This interrupt system is a connection to World War II small arms tactics, modeled after opportunity fire. This system allows for a dynamic, ever-changing board state that keeps players on their toes, even during their own turn. Understanding the core concepts of the action and hand management mechanisms within Wildlands, let's take a look at the individual warbands and how their playstyles will differ from one another based on their individual spread of action icons. The Lawbringers are doing everything they can to keep the peace, but after the cataclysm, it was a futile effort. Once society fell, the sheriff and his deputies had no choice but to release the forgotten prisoners they had left in their cells. They made a deal: freedom from your cell, or join the sheriff on his quest to bring law to the land. Each Lawbringer has his own specialty, making them a very versatile faction. They have a good mix of melee, ranged, area, and defensive abilities, and are very mobile, having the ability to rally other characters. The Lawbringers can pivot their tactical focus very easily. The GNOMADS are a ragtag collection of all races, led by 2 gnomes who fancy themselves blacksmiths, tinkers, and artificiers. This scrappy band travels the land in search of crystal shards to power their clockwork machinery. The gang is very fragile as they have a low amount of defensive capabilities, and they rely heavily on dealing damage from afar. But if they work together using the rally ability to move other characters in their faction, they can get where they need to be or out of a jam very quickly. The GNOMADS should focus on collecting crystals and staying out of the crosshairs of the other factions. The PITFIGHTERS are warriors, killers, and monsters, slaves doomed to engage in battle in the arena for the pleasure of others. But after the fall of the Empire, when the land was laid waste, no audiences were left to enjoy their glorious bloodshed. Now they roam the lands, searching for their glory in the wilds. These beasts are melee specialists and want to win by kills. They have absolutely no ranged or area of effect capabilities at all. They need to close and claim heads for points. Having spent the majority of their lives in the vast libraries studying and advising the ruling class, the guild all have a common goal. These wizards and witches will fight till their dying breath for the cause of the preservation of magic. And after the Empire fell, their goal continued, and they will one day restore the ruinous library to its former glory. The guild possesses significant defensive capabilities as they use cover to avoid attacks, but they can also dish it out with a good solid mix of melee and area of effect attacks. And they can also be very mobile because some of their characters can fly. The first expansion for Wildlands includes another faction called the Unquiet Dead. Like the Lawbringers, they have a pretty solid spread of abilities, making them a Swiss Army knife faction. But what really makes them shine is they only have 2 character icons for 6 characters, allowing their deck to have numerous action options on the board. And the Unquiet Dead expansion also adds a secondary play mode where, when characters die, they come back as zombies so that anyone can control them on the board. Some have said that an arena combat miniatures game is new territory for a designer made famous by railroads and ancient civilizations. Well, they're right. Wildlands is a departure from what we've come to expect from him. But make no mistake, this is a Martin Wallace game. We see the wonderfully clever and refined ghosts of board games past seeping through with a whole new experience from master game design artist Martin Wallace. Thank you all so much for joining me here on the first day of Tabletop Showcase's week of content focusing on Wildlands. Tomorrow you'll get a complete tutorial of exactly how to play Wildlands from Watch It Played, followed by more content from Board Game Replay, Rolling Dice and Taking Names, Drive-Thru Games, and finally Pair of Dice Paradise.